Welcome everyone to this today's seminar on which is on a decision focus for impact-oriented agricultural research. And as Hannah has said, this is something that I've been working on for a long time, and this line of work started when I was still at World Agroforestry in Kenya, and we're still doing it now, and we're also doing it within the Interfaces project. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about this today. So mainly. What this is about is the question how research actually generates impact. Some of us in science never really think much about this, but it's actually quite interesting when you do. And well, how I got into this was basically when I moved from a university environment to World Agroforestry back in 2010. All of a sudden, everybody was kind of questioning, like asking this question, what impact are you going to have and how exactly are you going to have impact? And this is something in the university we'd never really thought much about, and it wasn't really a relevant question. And all of a sudden, when, everybody at these CGIAR centers was, I think it started a little bit before, but it was going very strong at that time. Everybody was under pressure to basically articulate how their research was going to change the world. And of course, I mean, most of us on this meeting probably are scientists and we do our research and we kind of expect that somehow, or we hope that somehow this research will kind of lead to a better world somehow, will have some sort of impact. And the real question is really what happens in this era? How exactly is our work going to cause the world to be a better place? And really, when you start thinking about this, a little bit more deeply, you realize that actually there's a bunch of things that need to happen for this impact to unfold. And usually it takes many intermediate steps to generate the intended impact. Sometimes it never happens, of course, the chain can be interrupted. Usually in development-oriented research, you're now sort of requested always to articulate this impact and this mechanism of how impact happens through so-called impact pathways or theories of change or some other kind of theoretical conceptual construct that basically outlines how this all happens. This is often actually required now, again, not so much in a university environment, because often our money comes from some science foundations who aren't really so impact-oriented. But when development money is on the table, as is usually the case in CGIAR work or in much of the development-oriented agricultural research that many of us are involved in, then it is often required to justify what you're doing and to demonstrate that what you're doing actually delivers a value for money. Some donors are very much into this concept. The Gates Foundation, for example, you always have to basically justify that the money spent on you as a scientist is actually well invested. Now, how does this work? So impact pathways for research are a little bit tricky sometimes because it's relatively straightforward. If you have a development project, let's say you're giving people seeds for something, then it's relatively straightforward to articulate how impact unfolds. People plant the seeds, people get better crops, things like this. For research, it's often a little bit harder because research usually generates knowledge. We find out something that maybe wasn't known before or wasn't known in that context or whatever. We generate something that is new, some new knowledge product. And for this to really have a significant impact on the world, we really need some sort of mechanism for this knowledge, which is kind of this theoretical thing only. There needs to be some mechanism for this to affect real world processes. And generally, this is achieved by somebody somewhere out there in the right place, changing their behavior because of the research we've done. So the knowledge we have generated impresses people so much that they do things differently and better than they otherwise would have done. So this is almost the only pathway through which our research and the knowledge we generate can actually cause real change. And if you think about this even a little bit more deeply, you realize that the critical moment where change really starts to happen or where it accelerates somehow, it normally involves some sort of a decision. Somebody has to decide to do things differently. And hopefully the work that we do, the knowledge we generate, contributes or enables them to take this decision in a better way, in a better informed way. This is what we hope. And let me give you some examples of what these decisions could be. They could actually be at all kinds of different levels. They could, for example, be farmers adopting new crops or new practices. Yeah, so that's not straightforward usually, and there's often a lot of uncertainty when there's some innovation introduced into a farm. Which way do you go? Do you take it? Do you leave it? Yeah, what exactly do you adopt? At the policy making arena, there's also all kinds of decisions that are impactful. Yeah? Designing some sort of new legislation is something that policymakers do a lot, and obviously that can really change the course of many things in the country. And we know this in the European Union. Any sort of new subsidy on particular practices causes massive change often in the farming population. Governments may provide funding for certain practices. There's some sort of support schemes. NGOs may select specific scaling mechanisms for whatever innovations they may be promoting. Private investors may invest in particular value chains, and maybe development donors also decide to support certain interventions or actions. Yeah, so all of these are decisions that are relevant in the development arena, and you can imagine that depending on who exactly it is that decides here, these decisions can actually affect lots and lots of people and lots of livelihoods and the environment and all kinds of things that we care about. And if we as scientists somehow manage to influence such decisions, we can have real impact. Yeah, it is also quite obvious that many of these decisions at all kinds of different levels are made without appropriate information, without sufficient and comprehensive information. And this is definitely a space that we as scientists can get active in. Now, how can we actually influence decisions? Yeah, how can that little meager science we're doing, how can that influence what people decide and how people decide? Of course, the traditional way is that we kind of, as scientists, follow our own instincts of what to work on. Yeah, we have something that for some reason interests us, and we hope that some decision maker notices that what we've done and notices the results and changes their behavior. Yeah, so basically the decision maker making a decision somewhere will go to Web of Science or wherever, download our paper, read it, be so impressed that they kind of change their behavior. Now, is this likely to happen? Obviously not very, yeah, so it's actually very unlikely that this happens and hardly ever does. It's not very promising. Sometimes maybe it happens, it's not impossible, but it is not very likely. But of course we can try to make it more likely for people to take up our results, and this is then the next level up would be to design some sort of policy briefs. You've probably all heard about this before, or similar materials. Organize some sort of outreach meetings, and that's certainly a step in the right direction. But it may still be relatively unlikely that this actually causes a lot of change to happen. Yeah, partly because of who decision makers are and how they work, and to what extent they can really be impressed by some pamphlet that we design. I mean, maybe sometimes this works. But I still think there are probably more direct ways of influencing decisions that I want to talk about today. Because we can also try to really align our work with the information needs of decision makers. This essentially means that probably we will not be able to work only on our own pet projects, which as scientists may be a little bit of a difficult, toad to swallow. Yeah, so we may not be able to work on that one question that for some reason our previous training has prepared us for. We may be a little bit more flexible, but I think if we really understand what decision makers need and what they decide on, we can probably get a little closer to actually having influence. So how do we do this? How do we support decisions? I mean, first of all, we may have to understand what a decision maker is. I was actually at a workshop last week on a development-oriented project where people were trying to design advice for policymakers, and I had a feeling that they had no idea what policymakers actually are. Yeah, because of course these are people with certain profiles and certain job descriptions and certain interests, and with certain power and certain influence. And I think if we don't really fully understand who these people are, who we're actually talking about and talking to, it may sometimes be a little bit difficult. In most countries, or most contexts, there is actually not one decision maker, but it's kind of a more complicated situation that we somehow have to understand in order to really influence a decision. But more importantly, we probably need to identify some sort of concrete decisions that may actually support our objectives. Yeah, so there was an interesting experience that I had in the early days of my decision analysis career when we were working with teams of scientists from the CGIAR system from different centers, working on particular issues, doing science for development. And we actually, I don't know, challenged them to name particular decisions that are being made out there that their work could actually inform. And it was a very, very difficult challenge, apparently. In some cases, it took several meetings with a bunch of people for them to actually arrive at some sort of situation where a decision maker might actually need the information that they were generating. Yeah, so this is how poorly the awareness of the impact pathways was at that time. And things have improved since, but it was actually surprisingly challenging. We should then try to get to know and understand the decision-making process. Yeah, how do decisions actually get made? And also the decision makers. I mean, who are they? What are they interested in? Do they care at all about the topic that we are working on? Do they have maybe opposite interests from ours? Things like this. And it is then also an important step and a very, I think, fruitful step to try and involve stakeholders and decision makers in the work that we do. Yeah, because quite often we may do our little project, we don't even know who the decision makers are, and then we're done and we write up our results and we send the summary to the decision maker. That probably won't really work. Because people haven't been informed, they haven't been involved, they may even feel like they've been intentionally left out of the process, and it's actually somewhat unlikely that they will really take our results seriously. So we actually try to involve people in our work as early as possible, and we aim to produce information that fulfills certain criteria. And some of you may have heard about these, but it's actually quite important to, I think, understand that knowledge has different characteristics and attributes. If it is actually supposed to lead to impact, it should have these attributes at least. It should, for one thing, be credible. Yeah, so the information we generate should be credible, meaning it should be technically sound. Yeah, shouldn't be wrong. Should be like logically, I don't know, concluded from the data we find, for example. And this is something that every scientist kind of knows, hopefully, and we all adhere to this automatically, basically, because of the training we've received. But what we are less aware of is actually the other two categories that are just as important if you want to have real impact. And the second one is the salience of the work, and that's maybe a little bit harder to understand. It usually refers to the relevance of the information that we generate and the science we do for a particular context or for a particular decision. Is what we're finding out actually the information that is needed in order to make a real change? And in the third category, that may even, again, for an impact orientation, maybe even the most important category, is whether our knowledge, the information we generate, needs to be legitimate, meaning that it needs to be perceived as trustworthy by the next users, by the intended next users of the information, which are basically the people that need to receive that information and change their behavior because of it. Yeah, these could ideally be those decision makers that we sometimes have in mind, and they will probably, in many cases, they will only perceive us as trustworthy if they actually know who we are. Yeah, so they need to know who we are, they need to trust us somehow, and this is best achieved actually, again, by involving them as early as possible in the work, maybe even allowing them to contribute to framing the question we're working on and designing the study in the first place. So we've tried to kind of design a research approach based on all of this that, we sometimes call decision-focused research. Here's kind of the first major overview paper that we've written on this. And basically, in this line of work, we always take decisions as a starting point for the work. Yeah, so we don't go like to a system or to some location and completely try to understand everything that goes on in the system, but we actually try and identify decisions first, and we take things from there. Yeah, so basically trying to understand what exactly is being decided and who decides, and then we try to emulate that decision-making process. And then it's important to figure out what the implications are of the decision that is being taken. It's sometimes impossible to know this precisely, but there are always certain expectations and certain reasonable expectations we can formulate. Then as the next step, we try to figure out what the decision makers actually need to know. Yeah, in order to make the best possible decisions, there are certain knowledge needs that they have, and we try to understand as well as possible what these needs are. And then, rather than pretending like we often do in science that we know absolutely nothing about any of these things, we actually try and figure out what is already known. Yeah, because there are many things out there that we know absolutely nothing about. There's usually a reasonable range of values or like certain prior knowledge that we can use, that we can exploit in order to support a decision. And then after this, we can do some systematic analysis that I'll go into on the next slide. But after this, we can identify which of the knowledge gaps that may be there are actually the most pressing. Yeah, because of course there are many things out there that we don't know for sure, but many of them actually we don't need to know in order to take a particular decision. Some things are not really very important for a decision that we're taking, but some other things are usually actually quite crucial, and we should gather information on them. And this is what we try to figure out in this approach. So we have certain principles that we usually follow in our work that guide this essentially. And the most important, when you think about it, again, emulating a decision-making process, is actually to incorporate into a model that we make all the important aspects that matter to a decision. Yeah, so in science, we're often quite tempted to kind of restrict our modeling and our research to things that we can easily find out, or things that we have data for, that we know how to measure. But this, of course, isn't really how decisions are made. There are many things that are important for a decision that maybe there aren't immediately any data for. But if we neglect them, we may make big mistakes and have like major omissions in our process. Yeah, so I always use this barrel image here to illustrate why this is important. Many of you may have seen this barrel. It is usually used in plant nutrition to demonstrate the concept of essential plant nutrients. But we can also demonstrate the usefulness of a model using a similar approach. Basically, the usefulness of the model is the water that's in the barrel. And you can see that these different staves here, they have the different boards on the side. They represent different things that we can include in a model. Yeah, and as you can easily see, it doesn't make much of a difference if we find out more and more on input availability if we don't actually close our knowledge gaps on the markets. Yeah, so basically everything needs to be considered. Everything needs to be somewhat represented in the model for our model to actually be useful. We then, after making such a model, we try to model a system. After figuring out what aspects to include, we model a system basically using all sources of information. So everything we can find, we're going to use. Not only the perfect primary data that we've generated, but all other sources are just as welcome, including local and expert knowledge, because that's often the only source of information that we have for many things. But of course, and sometimes these things aren't perfect sources of information, but they are sources that can tell us something that is useful in many cases. We will then explicitly consider uncertainties about all the inputs, all the variables. What do we actually know? What don't we know? We try to quantify this and characterize this through probability distributions or confidence intervals, etc. Then we run probabilistic models. Yeah? So basically we run simulations that can deal with uncertain inputs, uncertain information about all the things that we don't know for sure. and they can convert this into outputs that are actually useful for a decision maker. Based on this, we identify key uncertainties for measurement. So sometimes actually after making the model and running the simulations, we can immediately make a recommendation. We can already see, oh, this is the way to go, or that's the way to go. If it's not the case, we can identify key uncertainties for measurement using so-called value of information analysis. And we'll then collect information and update the model when new information becomes available. So these are basically the principles that we apply always in our analysis. And based on these principles, we have designed a process that we usually follow. That is outlined here. Some of you may have seen this before. But as I said, we always start with a decision that we focus on. We then just basically turn ourselves into decision-focused researchers. So we focus there, and we take this as a starting point. We convene a panel of decision makers, stakeholders, and maybe some sort of academic experts that's often involved. And together we do a holistic and participatory decision analysis. So we really try to understand the decision in all its details and especially with all the ramifications that arise from it. Yeah? So all the consequences that the decision has, we're trying to characterize and convert into an impact model that we can then feed with a summary of the current state of knowledge on all the inputs that the model requires. So this can come from all kinds of sources. It can come from databases or books, certainly from the literature, but it can also come from the experts themselves. Yeah? So sometimes this is the best source of information we have. And rather than not considering important things, we'd rather take the estimates of experts to feed our model. Now, to enable people to actually do this properly, there's a process that we call calibration training, where we actually instruct people to how to make proper estimates. Yeah? So the question is here really that we ask of experts is, what is your state of knowledge? Yeah? What is your confidence, or what is the range that you can basically define for certain input variables that we may have in our model? For example, what's going to be the maize yield per hectare on this particular plot? Yeah, and then, of course, most experts won't really know this precisely, but they can usually give us some sort of a range estimate. Yeah? So they can say, oh, it's going to be between 3 and 7 tons per hectare or something of the sort. Yeah, and if this really reflects kind of their uncertainty and in a reasonable way, then this is actually very useful input. In order to train people in how to do this properly, there's this calibration training which has been shown to improve people's skills in making such estimates. So this is usually done before we ask estimates from people, and feed them into the model, and then run our simulations that allow us to forecast the outcomes of a decision. So basically we can tell, well, what the relative prospects of option A versus option B are in a decision-making situation. Sometimes this is already sufficient for making a great recommendation, so the preference is already clear. Yeah, so we often find out there's many things that are unknown, but it is actually quite clear that it's a great idea to, I don't know, switch to this new variety because it's definitely going to be so much better than what we had before. Yeah, so this can sometimes happen, and in those cases, we can immediately make a recommendation and feed back to the decision. But sometimes this is not clear. In that case, we identify major knowledge gaps. Yeah, based on the state of knowledge for everything that went in, we can identify which of these gaps are really critical. Then we can do some research in order to fill these gaps, or to narrow these gaps at least. We can update the state of knowledge, run our simulation again, and then eventually, hopefully, arrive at a recommendation. Sometimes we have to cycle through this process a few times until we get there. So that's the process, and we have a technical implementation of this. Essentially, this revolves around the decision support package for R, which we maintain in my team. And this usually starts with the technical part after the participatory analysis starts with a decision model that is written as an R function. And it's provided with an input table with distributions for all the variables in the model. And then based on this, we can run Monte Carlo simulations. This is all done with functions in this package to give us plausible outcomes for the decision. These results can then be evaluated. We can look at the outcome distributions, we can do a sensitivity analysis, and we can figure out which knowledge gaps are really still relevant. Now, this has long been kind of restricted to people who are familiar with the R programming language, but we're currently actively working on developing a more user-friendly interface where people, even without much programming knowledge, can use this, at least to some extent. We're making very good progress here, but it's maybe not entirely ready to be released. It will be coming soon. Okay, so this is the theory. I want to give you some examples of what we've done in the past. And here's kind of the first example, basically, that we've ever done here. The first large example that we've done. This was a project when I was still in Kenya about a pipeline to the city of Wajir in northern Kenya. And that was a pretty controversial decision. It was a real decision that was being taken at the moment by politicians in different places. And basically the idea was, so Wajir is a very kind of in a pretty dry region with major problems with water supply. And so the idea here was to tap an aquifer in a different city and supply the water to Wajir via a pipeline. Yeah? So it's about a 100-kilometer pipeline. And that was the plan. And it sounded great at the beginning to some people and not so great to other people. So it was pretty controversial and people weren't exactly on the same page. And so we came in and actually convened a workshop with a bunch of stakeholders. Yeah, so these are all people with some stakes in the model, including some analysts here too. Yeah, we basically conducted a decision analysis here. The actual model building team was smaller, but it was selected from among the people that you see here. And we were able to characterize actually all the benefits and the costs. This is kind of a high-level overview. There's a bit more detail under the hood here. But basically, we identified all the different stakeholders that were involved, all the different interest groups, and identified the costs and the benefits to all of them. And then eventually summarize these net benefits for all of the stakeholders. And it was actually quite interesting what came out of it, because essentially, so what these are the net benefits that we summarized based on the state of knowledge. And basically all these bubbles here indicate kind of the range of possible outcomes for the different stakeholders. And we don't need to know so much detail here, but basically what we can see here is that pretty much all these bubbles are pretty wide, pretty large. I mean, these are large numbers that we're talking about here. This goes into the billions of US dollars, this entire scale here, because this is a big project for a somewhat large city. But what's striking is that on almost all these bubbles stretch quite substantially into the negative and into the positive parts of the scale. Yeah, and that basically means that with the current state of knowledge that everybody had, nobody should actually have had a clear opinion on whether this was good or bad, because nobody really knew much about it. And for example, the people who were in the city who were going to receive the water in Wajir were excited about getting clean water. That's nice, yeah. But what they didn't really have on their in their evaluation, that they were going to pay for this water. Yeah, so it wasn't actually going to be free. So there would be some considerable costs actually coming up for them. The people in the place where the aquifer was going to be tapped were worried about their water being taken away, but of course they were going to be paid for this. Yeah, so that was also something that they didn't have in mind. And so overall, this whole thing was actually incredibly uncertain. And predicting the impacts was almost impossible. And there were quite considerable knowledge needs that were still emerging in this case. So here we see the net decision outcome of this project that we predicted. And you see that the percentage of negative outcomes where the net value was actually negative, if we summed up all the different stakeholder benefits, was actually greater than the share of positive outcomes. And what you can see here in the red, there's this big spike, which are basically all situations where the project was started and all the money was spent, but the whole thing was actually not successful. Yeah, there were big risks in the technical implementation. There were big risks related to potential political interference that might actually make the entire project fail, which is something that, of course, needs to be considered when you make these kind of decisions. We also identified key uncertainties here, and they were things that initially weren't on the radar of the planners at all. They were looking at the hydrological situation and things like this, but we actually found the key uncertainties being, well, the biggest one was actually the value of reducing infant mortality, because that was going to be one of the major benefits of having clean water in Wajir. And of course, this somehow needs to be weighed against the money that this whole thing would cost. It's a very controversial and ethically difficult question, but it's something that actually arises often in these decision-making processes. We also identified the risk of poor project design and the risk of political interference as major questions to the viability of this decision. Yeah, and the measurements that had been commissioned before we did our analysis actually had fairly little information value. As I said, they were mainly related to the hydrological risks, and these were actually quite well, easily understandable. I mean, it's not an easy aquifer and stuff, but the uncertainties there were actually smaller, the uncertainties in other regions and other parts of the project that people hadn't even really thought about much. Another example, a bit more recent, is on agroforestry adoption in Vietnam. This was another decision we took. In this case, not some political decision makers, but the decision makers here was actually a farmer considering adopting agroforestry, fruit tree-based agroforestry in Vietnam. Here in northern Vietnam, this is the study region. And these are the different system designs that people were considering. There were some simple agroforestry situations, some maize-based agroforestry, some coffee-based agroforestry. So different options were evaluated here. This was an ECRAF project, so a World Agroforestry project that had been going on for a long time. And people had been doing all kinds of tests on this, but what they didn't really have is any sort of evaluation of the long-term prospects of these options, because it takes a long time to grow these systems and for them to mature. Yeah, so in most cases, decision makers on such things, they don't want to wait for 20 years until they actually know whether something is viable. So our modeling approach was actually quite useful in this case to give people an idea of how economically viable these systems are. Yeah, so this is what it looks like. There are big benefits to introducing agroforestry here, mainly because of major erosion problems that people have in this landscape. So this analysis was done by Hua Do, who has just submitted her PhD thesis in my team. I just found it last week, so she's going to graduate soon. And this is her workflow here. Basically, so she identified experts first, and together they developed a model. They did this probability assessment, ran simulations, and then added information if necessary, refined the model. It's basically a modification of the process that I just showed you already. And here's her model. It's not very complicated, but basically she was able to tabulate all the benefits and the costs of implementing agroforestry. So there are certain establishment costs, there are maintenance costs, there are different benefits that need to be considered, and all of them together result in a certain revenue. There are certain risks that are involved. Trees may fail for some reason, or the weather may not allow a harvest of a particular crop at a particular time. These kind of things, of course, also need to be factored in. But if you do all of this and add all of this up, you get to the so-called net present value of a decision, which is then a nice way of evaluating whether something is feasible or not. And here are some outcomes. I don't want to go into too much detail here. But basically, through these probabilistic simulations, Hua was able to simulate the net benefits of all these different options. You see this in the first column here. You see these are all distributions, so we don't know for sure what is going to happen if we start a certain system, but we can get a certain feeling for the range of values that are likely. So we can see that the maize is almost certainly going to generate some sort of profit, but it's actually a relatively low profit. So these are all relatively close to zero. Whereas the tree-based systems, especially when you look at kind of the lowest graph here, the longer maize grass system, can actually generate much higher returns in the long run. Yeah, so we can also look at what variables actually influence the difference between these different options, and we can look at which variables actually carry a lot of weight for somebody trying to decide between maize monoculture and these agroforestry options. Yeah, so this value of information is particularly interesting. That is the last column here, the one on the right. And you see that usually there aren't a lot of variables here. And in one case, there's even no variable that is listed here. And this actually quite often happens, which is, and is mainly arises in situations where with all the uncertainties we have, we're actually already pretty sure that we can make a decision on what is better. Yeah, so we can make a recommendation even with all this uncertainty still on the table. Yeah, so basically we have these high value variables for follow-up research. These are just the value of information. And in this particular case, it turns out that all agroforestry options were quite promising in the long term, but they do require quite a bit of initial investment. And so this was actually the major bottleneck that you identified. And you can see this especially in the middle graph here, there's always this kind of very long bar for the so-called discount rate. And the discount rate basically is an economic concept that basically indicates the extent to which farmers actually need income now compared to the future. So poor farmers usually need money very soon because they have to pay bills that they otherwise don't have any reserves for, and they can't wait for these trees to grow and actually yield fruit. And this was the major bottleneck that we identified here. Yeah, so these are two examples. We have quite a few more case studies on quite a few different contexts and different geographies by now. Be happy to share more if anyone should be interested. I'll share my email later on. Now we also apply decision analysis in the interfaces project. Some of you, I think some of you have had contacts with this already. And it's mainly Dorcas Sanginga and Peter Asare who do this. Dorcas at least is here in the meeting today as well. And they apply decision analysis within the interfaces project. And one of the major events that was held was an expert workshop for sustainable land management in northern Ghana, facilitated here by the two. So Dorcas is a lady on the left here, and Peter is the guy standing next to her. This generated information for the COINS project so far, mainly for the intervention on sustainable business models for integrated fertility management, ISFM. And for the Déclaré project, we're also doing an analysis, or Dorcas is leading an analysis on fertilizer microdosing in parkland systems. So these are the major cases that we're analyzing here. And I'm allowed to show you some results already. These were generated by Dorcas, so she can probably also take questions if you have specific questions later on. But basically, what happened here is a similar thing to what I've described to you. This process, she followed basically our process here with our own conceptualization of it. And you see in step one here, it's first important to define the decision. Yeah, what are farmers, for example, deciding, or what does the government decide? Who actually decides something here? Again, this is sometimes not straightforward because it may not actually be the farmer just deciding, should I do this or should I not do this? It may actually be an NGO deciding, well, should we promote integrated soil fertility management? Or it may be the government deciding on whether their extension system should promote this. Or it should be somebody, some donor, or again, the government deciding on, should we put money onto this? Should we actually subsidize inputs for this practice? Yeah. So there are many decisions that could actually lead to some impact from these kind of practices, and the farmers may be the ones deciding, or it may be somebody else. Yeah. So the precise focus of the model is something that first needs to be identified here. But I believe in this case, it is the farmer's perspective that was considered. What was then done was, during this workshop that I just showed you a picture from, was that people developed participatory impact pathways, or developed impact pathways to participatory projects rather, quantified all inputs to the models, ran these simulations, made forecasts, and eventually came up with a model to identify which is the better decision, which is the best decision option here, the best land management option, and what knowledge gaps remain. Here's some, so they came up with a pretty comprehensive representation of all the impact categories identified during the workshop, and then developed a model that aims at comparing decision options. Yeah, so there are quite a few things here. I don't want to go into too much detail because I believe I'm not going to talk for several hours, and I actually may not have time to do that either. But you see that there are many things that are involved here. You have various costs, mainly on the in the upper part of the graph. Everything in yellow are cost items. Everything in blue is related to benefits, and you also see certain risk factors here, market risks, production risks. So the ambition here is to make as comprehensive a model of the decision situation as possible, and then to figure out whether this is actually ultimately beneficial for farmers to adopt these kind of practices. Here's some outputs now. So the model was run on a 10-year basis. Yeah, so basically it's a 10-year forecast, and or in this case of a maize and soybean system versus a so it's the sorry, I had this covered by my other window here. So a 10-year forecast of the ISFM, so integrated soil fertility management options in maize and soybean systems in comparison to the maize monoculture with no soil amendments, which is currently kind of practiced by many farmers. And here are the options. So these are different types of land management. Yes, so the complete ISFM is the kind of the pink lines here. The status quo is the orange, and everything else between these are different improvements that people can make that don't quite reach the level of entirely being ISFM. Yeah, so there's some just changes in tillage, for example. There's just changing to improved seeds or to mineral fertilizer, and basically for all of these options, we can identify the net benefits. Yeah, so the benefits or like the impacts are on the x-axis here. You see different ones, different categories: the productivity benefits, income benefits, environmental benefits, social and human benefits. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative probability. So essentially, to read this, basically, you'd say that everything that like the more to the right these different curves are, the greater the benefits are that are generated. And what we can see quite clearly here is that full adoption of ISFM of all the ISFM components is the most sustainable, or at least the most profitable of the options. Yeah, so we would actually recommend to farmers that they should that they should adopt the whole thing. Obviously, based on this, necessarily they won't do this. Yeah, so they're not going to necessarily be able to read these results and follow exactly what we do. But we actually, based on this analysis, we could now be quite confident in recommending to an extension service that this is actually a good idea to promote this. We may have done this already before, but if we're really honest, we'd usually, as scientists working on ISFM, we very, very readily accepted, yes, definitely this is environmentally great, that you can have higher yields, but sometimes we would still have some uncertainty about kind of the labor demands or the inputs or the actual yield benefits or whatever. We may not actually be entirely sure, but such an analysis actually gives weight for our advice to an NGO or to the government, and helps us and them make the business case for the process, for the practices that we're promoting. We can also, using similar analyses, we can be a little bit more nuanced and actually simulate not only the overall impacts of a decision, but also analyze this based on different social groups or different members of the target group that we may have in mind. Because farming populations, of course, are not homogeneous. Now we often have men and women for sure, but we also have all kinds of other groups that may or may not be in a good position to benefit from these practices. So there's some farmers who own land, some who don't own land, some are large, some small, some have lots of resources, some are massively in debt already. Yes, so there are all kinds of different situations, and using these kind of models that we can develop here, we can actually try and simulate to what extent different groups benefit from the practices we're promoting. I don't want to go into too much detail here, also because I think these labels need to be improved still. But we do see roughly that it's often kind of, especially men with already pretty high input and high income and high land endowment, who are the ones who benefit most from this practice and many other practices, whereas in many cases, women without lots of land, for example, are not in a great position to benefit, because often they can't make the investment, or they may not have kind of labor to spare or whatever. There may be different reasons for this, but it actually, well, these causal models we're building here, these decision models, give us a good opportunity for also disaggregating input outcomes for different groups by these kind of categories. But I do find that land, knowledge, and finances and labor are vital for the success of ISFM. And farmers' income is influenced by access to all of these resources. And we do find that complete ISFM is profitable, but it's not necessarily equitable. And maybe we need some additional interventions that actually make sure that everybody benefits, including those groups that usually wouldn't. So the next innovation that I just want to mention, because the analysis isn't really done yet, is on microdosing in agroforestry systems. This is for the Declaré project, and the conceptual model is already developed. This is essentially it, but I don't think it has actually led to any simulations yet. But this is the next thing that Dorcas is going to focus on once the ISFM manuscript is done, which I think it is already. It's actually on my desk, and I'm the one holding up the process. So this is probably already work in progress. And I'm going to just come to my conclusions and be done, Hannah. So my take-home messages from this. I think a focus on decisions is cool. I've actually been quite sold on this for quite a long time, and I'm still excited about this opportunity, because a focus on decision can simplify research questions. And we don't no longer have to understand everything, which is almost always impossible. We can simplify and actually focus on what is actually really relevant and important. And this allows us to provide targeted support for real-life decisions, and it opens opportunities for addressing complexity, mainly by realizing that we don't have to know everything for sure. We can work with approximations and estimates, but we can actually try to also develop models for complex situations where not everything is known. It allows working with uncertainty and with fuzziness, which is pretty much always unavoidable in decision-making contexts. And it enhances the impact prospects of our research, because we focus directly on the intervention points where impact may actually start or be accelerated. And I think particularly important or promising is that it provides a natural focus for the participation of stakeholders and decision makers in our work, because it's often actually quite hard to get decision makers especially excited about what we do, because they may not see the relevance of it for their own work. But if we actually identify a decision that's on their mind anyway, it actually makes it, in our experience, much more likely for people to get involved. I think it raises the salience, the relevance of our research, because we really try to design our work in a way that is relevant. And it makes it more likely that research is considered legitimate by those people who we want to be using what we do, because they can be involved and we're actually working on their problems, ideally, and we try to understand what they work and what they care about and what they need to know. And that's it. Thanks for listening. This is our package, and I hope there'll be some questions from the audience now. Thank you.